first of a series of 15 webinars that we're planning to have over the next couple of weeks. And the main objective really of our webinars is to, as an organization that is really set up to amplify the voices of the poor, to influence policy processes in the region that are aimed at reducing poverty and inequality. Just felt that we were at a moment in history where the voice of citizens, especially the voice of ordinary citizens, matters the most. So we are here aiming to structurally and yet organically connect civil society, community foundations, members of the community and different stakeholders to different audiences for purposes of sharing lessons and experiences and solutions on our lived realities and some of the challenges that we're facing as society at the moment. The first topic, I'm going to ask that you please mute all the participants, and if colleagues could kindly mute, if you could mute your mics so that we minimize the feedback, we would really appreciate that. Thank you. As I was saying, the webinar series is designed to structurally and yet organically connect civil society, community foundations, members of the community and to different stakeholders and audiences for purposes of sharing experiences, knowledge and solutions about some of the challenges that we face every day. And we really felt that there is no better moment to launch the series of webinars, citizen-driven webinars, particularly looking at where we are in this moment in history. And the first of our series is reflecting on the Southern Africa region's different responses to COVID-19. And we are having this conversation at a point where I was just looking at some of the scary data and statistics that is coming in. And the UN Economic Commission for Africa just recently sent out a statement that was sharing estimates that at least more than 1 billion cases of COVID-19 are projected in Africa. And with that, they are estimating that we will be losing 300,000 people to COVID or even more. These are very scary statistics. And they're of concern to us. And there's a lot of issues that are being highlighted about the adequacy and the preparedness of our continent, but also the adequacy and responses that we're seeing our various governments in the region implement. I have an esteemed panel with us this afternoon. We've got 3 esteemed speakers from the civil society sector, and they come from different backgrounds. We've got Nnimmo Bassey, who is an environmental justice advocate and director of the ecological think tank, Health of Mother Earth Foundation, based in Nigeria. Nnimmo, welcome. And we also have Liepollo Lebohang Pheko, who is a senior research fellow at a think tank Trade Collective. She's a political and feminist economist and a public intellectual. Welcome to you, Lebohang. We also have with us our sister, Nancy Kachingwe. Nancy is a freelance consultant who specializes in women's rights, in policy advocacy and advocacy strategies, in public policy, and her work focuses on supporting NGOs through analysis, training, program formulation with a feminist political economy lens as well. Without further ado, I think I'm going to start with Nnimmo, by giving Nnimmo a platform. Nnimmo, you've been writing quite extensively about the current COVID crisis, and you have written elsewhere that the projections that we're seeing about the pandemic and its impact in Africa, we ought to take those projections with a pinch of salt. And you're encouraging us to dig a little bit deeper and ask whose interests are these projections being driven from. and also to ask the question around what weight they carry depending on who the messenger is behind the projections. You've also argued elsewhere that a lot of African countries have stepped up. And yet at the same time, some of your writing has been very critical of the response that we're seeing coming from the region. You talked about, I'll read an excerpt from one of your writings where you said that politicians have used the emergency as an excuse to shut national borders, as though the coronavirus could be stopped by a wall or by a border police for that matter. And you end that statement by saying myopia can be a disease as dangerous as COVID-19. Why do you say that? And why is it that there seems to be some contradictory messages that are coming from some of the writings that you have shared? But what are you seeing as the responses that are coming from the continent? Nnimmo?
Thank you, Masego. I heard you clearly. And thank you so much for having me on this very esteemed panel. And thanks for all those who are able to join us. I'm very worried about the responses to the pandemic because there's a lot of showmanship around it. And there's a lot of marketing of products around it. It does appear to me like many are taking the pandemic as a business opportunity, which is not surprising because we have the shock doctrine. Whenever people can be terrorized or locked up into places, then you can do other things that you really want to do. But I do recognize the fact that the pandemic is a serious matter. It's a health issue, and we have to be as careful as we can be to ensure that we are not infected by the virus. So that is that. But when I hear somebody declare before even it became a pandemic that unless there's a vaccine, many people are going to die in the developing world, I see it as clearly a marketing idea, that somebody is wishing that Africans would drop dead in the default. At the point it was said that millions and millions of Africans are going to die because of this pandemic. Now we're hearing 300,000, and I'm saying, okay, so why are you turning down the number? Why is it not going up, further up? Now we've been in this thing for a couple of weeks. So I really want us to take some of those projections. While at the same time recognizing the fact that we kind of respond this pandemic with virus come from. Did it come from? There's so many theories flying about. We don't know where. If we don't know the roots, it's difficult to overcome it. And so I would like our governments and research institutes to invest more in tracking the nature and origin of that virus, because we may end up being used as guinea pigs for experimentation for somebody who wants to market vaccine. Now, for one thing, let me say something about that vaccine before I drop the mic, so to speak. Bill Gates said at a TEDx talk that he has invested in about 7 factories manufacturing vaccines. And he does know that this is a very heavy investment, but he says maybe 1 or 2 may be endorsed at the end of the day. 1 or 2 endorsed at the end of the day would mean trillions of dollars. So this basically is a business enterprise. The other thing I want to say is that this approach also fits into, I don't want to say conspiracy theory, but we've also heard these marketers saying that the challenge for the world is overpopulation and that the world needs to be depopulated. Now, to me, that is a criminal declaration of intent, and that should be addressed in itself.
I'm muted, Nnimmo. Thanks for that. I think you raise an important point there about some of the business interests that might be at play around the COVID response, and you're linking it to the pharmaceutical industry and what we're hearing there. But I just want to switch to Liepollo at this point and just ask Lebohang to just share insights with us on what you're seeing as trends coming out of the region in terms of state responses. Do you think we have adequate responses? Are we seeing the numbers not exponentially as anticipated because perhaps our governments are taking the right steps?
Interesting question. Thank you so much, and to all the the co-panelists as well as all the other colleagues who are here with us. So I think it's some of the initial responses are quite telling. The one is immediately that all of us have decided across the continent, including SADC, that the first is to restrict movement of people, national curfews. It's actually a state of martial law. And I think it's quite important in terms of language that we are mindful of what we're dealing with. The language of lockdown I find extremely disturbing because it's actually cognitively incredibly violent. So, when we are getting acclimatized globally to the notion that we are locked down, held down in some form of incarceration with which we are in cooperation in some respect because we decided to cede a lot of our power to our states so that our states can, inverted commas, save us. The second, of course, is the restriction of movement. As Nnimmo mentioned, that the virus is not known to respect borders per se, but of course the first instinct of all countries globally has been to close down borders and to restrict naturally the flow of people and flights, travel, and so on. And then the third aspect of this is, of course, the economics of it. So different countries and different governments have taken on different ways of trying to find solutions and find meaning in this. Government wage assistance schemes, some kind of introduction of self-employed assistance, especially in Mauritius. Places like South Africa, of course, last night unveiled a 500 billion rand package of a whole mix compact, a new social compact to augment social welfare grants, child support grants, to actually bring into the matrix people who are not on any form of grant nor are eligible for UIF, to also then assist companies in terms of their capacity to pay skills development levies, to pay salaries, to pay rents, and to continue to keep the lights on. This is in sharp contrast to the 2008 relief model, which was entirely corporatist, entirely linked to trying to bail out banks, bail out the very culprits who had gotten most of global humanity, the markets, the workers, into the mess, the irresponsible mess that we found ourselves in thereafter. So this is a marked difference. And I think also worth saying that across the continent, commensurate to many GDPs, we've certainly tried very hard as African countries to provide a layer of cushioning in sometimes very difficult circumstances. Again, I think even Rwanda has had some very interesting attempts to try to involve small business holders. And I think that's a very important thing, that small business entrepreneurs, often called, I think, and I've said before, the informal sector, which is in fact the real sector, the parallel sector. I call it the horizon sector because it's visible and tangible, and yet we cannot really see where it begins and where it ends. It's on the horizon somewhere, and of course, not always subject to state regulation. This is a moment where I can see for the first time where it's interesting that that very sector, spaza shops, small restaurants in South Africa called chisanyamas, your small barbecue stands, not informal, but your unregistered barbecue stands and unregistered small restaurants and takeaways are being considered as very key to the economy. I think the other thing that's quite important at a time like this is, at a time of global suffering and mass deprivation, the notion of welfareism has to change. The language of welfareism and the recontracting between states and citizens and residents has to shift significantly. And the notion of shaming and calling, suggesting that some are freeloaders or want to absent themselves from the market economy is really, really problematic. And I think lastly, one of the things that as well has been quite important in this is the executive measures that are arising out of the state of emergency. And I think the languaging around this is quite interesting. Some have called it a state of national emergency. Others have called it a national health emergency, and others have called it a national disaster. And this is quite cruel because this then gives the executive, the army, the police and criminal justice machinery the opportunity to intervene as they see fit. When we speak of a state of an emergency, we imagine people running helter-skelter, tear gassing, and so on and so on. And yet the emergency is that we have to be indoors. Thank you.
Lebohang, thank you. And apologies, colleagues. It seems like we were not spared of the hacking of this webinar, despite the security measures that we put in place. So let you able on the line, please just make sure that we are not getting hijacked and being subjected to obscenities that we're hearing coming through the line. Unfortunately, this is one of the risks with these open platforms as we try and open up the dialogues to as many people as possible. It seems we're having some challenges there. But thank you Lebohang, for your interventions there. I think you raised some very important points there. One around the securitization of state responses that we're seeing coming through. You also began to highlight some of the progressive responses that we have seen come out of Mauritius and come out of South Africa, just in terms of being inclusive and responding to the realities of the structures of our economies. But I actually wonder to what extent is that kind of progressive level of response being seen and reflected elsewhere in the region? And I think this is a perfect moment to bring in Nancy. Nancy, what are the responses that you're seeing? And are there any gaps in what we're seeing the states in terms of state responses? And I keep emphasizing on the state because what we have seen so far is with that securitization of the response and COVID being declared a national disaster, we haven't seen much space being created for citizens to be driving part of the policy responses that we're seeing. Nancy?
Thank you for having me, and congratulations on bringing us all together from the region. It's always a great opportunity. Gaps, of course there are gaps. I mean, there's huge craters in some places and spaces. I think it's fair to say this is a sort of unprecedented epidemic. On the other hand, if you look through the sort of documentation from WHO, pandemic and epidemic preparedness has always supposed to been part of countries' health strategies. So there are certain things that are supposed to be responses where you pretty much can, it's like flipping a switch and you can move into gear. And it's quite clear that the wherewithal to do that and to respond rapidly and to have a system that could just kick into gear over a major emergency, which, you know, this is the same disaster response plans that we're supposed to have even for natural disasters or others. So that machinery was found wanting. I think that would be the first thing to say in terms of like overall, yes, it's unprecedented, but it's not an excuse for finding oneself caught short. There's probably different dimensions where we can examine. I've kind of split them up, but there are the issues around sort of like the kind of polities and political economies that we're in, where we have states that are quite patriarchal, top-down, conservative, quite secretive and untransparent very often, and hesitant to open up and to real dialogue and ideas and to be responsive. It may actually be a problem that our states have or our states and bureaucracies are being turned more into contract managers for outsourcing rather than actual service delivery and operationally and logistically competent entities. So that's something that we probably want to think about. Sort of the relationships that are built with civil society around a lot of technical issues like health. We do have quite good we do have bodies or structures and institutions that are supposed to facilitate this dialogue. It just seems that in the case of an emergency now, they have not been putting these to good use to really, get ideas and thoughts and be planning. So just that sort of infrastructure where you can get ideas from all the various quarters seems to there's room for improvement there. And it does tend to be that those who have more money, more voice, get more of a hearing and their interests represented compared to others. At another level, there's the sort of health and medical responses. We all know our health infrastructure has been shown to be completely, pretty much a public infrastructure at any rate, threadbare in terms of the what is needed. Because medical responses are limited, apart from testing and some treatment, it's the non-medical responses that are required. And in a situation where you do require both sort of behavioral change, you're talking about lockdowns, which Lebohang has talked about as a response. All of those need to be, well planned, well thought through, and require a lot of participation. So you do need an attitude and a leadership that is participatory in order for the non-medical response to the pandemic, which is really critical to be able to be kicked into gear. But back to sort of our health infrastructure, I think, lesson learned from immediately now, the first order of business has to be talking about health and health related infrastructure, public infrastructure. And let's forget about the sort of private-public partnerships that was going to be the silver bullet to fund health infrastructure. The donor dependency in terms of our health is also something that we have to end. It's far too dependent on donors. We see that in areas like sexual health and reproductive rights, but many other areas where it's just a donor-driven agenda in terms of what gets attended to and what doesn't. I think we are all concerned about, talked about the state being a public manager, concerned about the rent-seeking behavior, this being a business opportunity, and the sort of outsourcing of state capacity. Those are concerns. But overall, the questions around additional water, sanitation, housing have clearly been issues that we need to think about. And just finally, the question of our demographics and our socioeconomic realities. It's really clear that our states don't have the data, they don't have a grip. They don't have a grip on these sort of day-to-day realities. Families, what are the kinds of families we have? We don't have a the heteropatriarchal family is not something that exists. Employment and unemployment and how to deal with those. Rural, urban differences. So all of these different differences and groups, there doesn't seem to have been a pandemic response plan that is able to cater for these different types of groups, even though in this region we are a fairly low density, low population kind of region, and it shouldn't be that big an issue compared to like very large countries to be able to deal with these different groups and find differentiated approaches tailor-made for those. Those are my first comments.
Thank you, Nancy. And I hate so much to have to interject when you're getting into it like that.
I was done.
But, as I'm listening to you, I'm thinking, I mean, these are policy issues and gaps that as civil society, as public scholars and public intellectuals, we've been highlighting for many, many years. And you, Nancy, were one of the people who actually early on said, we don't have a shortage of analysis. We don't have a shortage of an understanding of what the issues are. Perhaps what we lack is a strategy around how we ensure that our states, these ideas and solutions that we have gain traction with decision makers within the state apparatus. And I know Nnimmo is about to jump off. And Nnimmo, I just would like to give you a platform to say what you think are the strategies that we need in order to move this process forward and to make sure that, as Nancy says, that our states are able to draw on the good ideas that sit with a lot of actors in civil society. And then just to say that we're going to open up the chat function of Zoom so people can ask questions, and I'll throw the questions back to the panelists. Nnimmo?
All right, thank you, Masego, and thank you for giving me the space to make the last comment before I jump away. And thank you so much, Nancy, for the analysis and the other analysis that we had. I just want to say that really, we've seen what happened with this pandemic, that no nation on earth, not one nation was ready for it. That says a lot about investment in the health sector across the world. And it says a lot more about what is going on our continent, because in our continent, we don't only have a shortage of social safety nets, poor health infrastructure. We also have the unfortunate situation where transnational corporations and national corporations keep on degrading our environment, thereby lessening our capacity to resist any kind of disease that may happen. We're fighting Ebola, we're fighting malaria, we're fighting pneumonia, we're fighting everything. And yet our politicians don't think we should work for the ecological health of Africa. So number one thing for me is that this is time for us to look at the health of our environment, because the way we treat the planet is the way the planet treats. And the planet can do without us. So this, to me, is very critical. And that means also that, hearing me? Can you hear me now? Oh, sorry.
I hear you. Now we can hear you.
Yeah, my internet is unstable. I'm just concluding the last sentence is that a one-size-fits-all solution would not work. And that is why they can't be telling us social distancing. Social distancing wouldn't work in our continent. We can tolerate physical distancing, but social distance clearly attacks our social fabric. We live in community. We live in families. We are not isolated individuals. And so even the concept itself needs to be re-examined. And I would look forward to reading more about what came out from this discussion. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Nnimmo. Thank you for joining us. We really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Some profound words there. If we don't treat the F well, it will not treat us well either. And I think it goes back to just the understanding that this is not only a health crisis, it's an economic crisis as much as it is an ecological crisis. I wanted to open up for questions for our panelists on the chat function there. I'm not seeing any letter unless if I'm looking at the wrong screen. But perhaps you can help me with reading them out. And while we do that, I'd just like to go back to Lebohang and Nancy with the same question that I was asking Nnimmo around what are the strategies for going forward, and just making sure that the voices of experts, activists, and practitioners in the continent can be heard by policymakers and can gain traction in our policy spaces.
Okay. Nancy, do you want to go ahead or shall I?
Please go ahead.
Okay, thanks. I mean, I think thanks for the question, Masego. There's so much that's happening right now, and you're quite right. We need to think about a new political ecology of what we're doing. And the INGO and the global context, the community context, the social movement context has shifted, and the contours have to shift. We need to be responsive to what we're seeing around us, as you say, as public intellectuals, as academics, activist scholars, feminists, environmentalists, and so on. And I would think that what we really need to create is some sort of a commonwealth, a trust fund, a mind fund, a brain trust of thoughts, a repository. And we don't seem to have spaces where we can park and model those sorts of alternative ideas. And the last big idea that I think, space that used to house that, would have been, of course, the World Social Forum and Africa Social Forum and Southern Africa Social Forum, which many of us on this call were a part of, and which I think I was a part of formulating many of the early steerings and the thoughts around that. But we don't have those sorts of brains trusts where we can model what an alternative could be. The other thing I think is also around languaging, where we have peripheralized ourselves so much that we think of ourselves as alternative. And I'm even correcting myself as I'm speaking to say that we need to mainstream and to center stream our own ideas and our own thoughts, because what we've been calling the alternative is the only logical way. I mean, years ago, we coined not only that another world was possible, but I would add inevitable and necessary, because the old is broken, toxic, very, 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 very violent. As Nnimmo said, the earth is really reflecting back at us what we have done to her all of this time. And this inherent chauvinism between ourselves and the earth, men and women, elders and children, and so on, between small businesses and large businesses, states and their subjects, is really, really important to completely reframe. And I would see that then as bringing in different movements, worker movements, student movements, feminist movements, and I would really want to center African feminist movement building in that, because I've been arguing that feminist thinking is the only way, it's the only reproach to the exigencies, the excesses of masculinized corporate politics, masculinized economic thinking, which wants to rescue corporates whilst leaving workers and small businesses, small-scale entrepreneurs, registered and unregistered, adrift. I think I also would think that this is an important time for us to rethink what we want our states to be in relation to securitization and militarization. And again, I offer feminist theory as a very important way of doing this, because the masculinized character of the state is exactly why things are as they are. We know best. The father state knows best and understands best. We will protect you. We've got your interests at heart. Don't ask any questions. It's going to be okay, little children. And clearly it's not okay at all. And this is why we have these ridiculous access to information bills, which often obfuscate what we need to know and hear. We also have this notion that, of course, that things that are actually about public concern and rights issues, human dignity issues, are then framed into securitization. So, for example, drug trafficking, human trafficking, migration, all of these are framed as things that are illicit in some way, rather than being part of a human condition. So even in this now, borders immediately being put up in the name of a virus which is borderless to all intents and purposes. You'll be aware that South Africa has been trying to build a wall up near Bushbuck Bridge, and there's a big scandal because after 37 billion rands, we cannot quite account for whatever has been constructed there. But the notion that states and processes are neutral is also something else that I'd like to put forward as being a part of our repository of investigation and debunking, because processes are not neutral at all. They're not gender neutral, they're not corporate neutral, and they're not people neutral. If we say we're imposing a curfew, we are then imposing the fact that people are going to be enclosed, women are going to be imprisoned with their abusers. Businesses, small businesses, unrecognized and parallel or horizon businesses, as I've described them, are not going to be able to sustain themselves in ways that then give rise to an ongoing ecology of mutual benefit. So in all of this, we have to find spaces and places to house them, whether it's through new forms of social movement building and these virtual spaces which we are seeing emerge, new forms of academic scholarship, what good old Cabral used to call the revolutionary intelligentsia, which many of us would like to think in some way we are part of carrying that kind of a torch. And we also need to really think around ways in which we rethink ways in which the marginal must become central. And you see a question about people living with disabilities. We never ever talk about this. And at a time like this, when we are contained and we are actually, we never talk about the psychosocial impact of this. People who are already struggling with depression, loneliness, especially in the global north. I think we're a bit better. We have a strong sense of community here. Where then are the spaces to embed all of this psychosocial health as a basic human dignity, human rights issue, as a part of state building new states and new narratives? Thanks.
Thank you so much there, Lebohang. And I think Nancy, perhaps you can take some of the questions that Lebohang didn't address. I think she addressed one of the questions that was for Nnimmo, which was whether the corona crisis is related to fossil fuel exploitation, when I think she started talking about the political ecology of what we're seeing. And the question on disability there, to some extent, has also been addressed. But there's one other question here where Christabel says, I have a challenge with African countries adopting solutions based on experiences developed in the West. And how can we adapt solutions to our local context? You are on mute.
Okay, yeah. Just maybe quickly on the strategies. I think that our previous experiences where we've achieved big changes has been through these big kind of coalitions, cross-sectoral. I think in the women's rights movement, that's been our experience to push legislation. It's really been through sort of coalitions, people coming together, having a diverse range of expertise, a cross-section of all the different social actors, trade unions, etc., working together. We need to learn lessons from some of the mistakes that we've made, including mistakes around who's excluded, who's included, what are the kinds of power dynamics, and how we replicate our own sort of more authoritarian, patriarchal regimes. But I think that we have experiences where we can think about how we've achieved change, and what we have been able to do for that, and can we do something specific in relation to what's going to be quite a big health challenge. In terms of the people with disabilities, so I think that we need to support all the different groups. That we have a lot of groups working on issues, associations of different interests, people with disabilities, sort of gender, informal sector, and so on and so forth. We do have to collectively support and amplify voices from outside of civil society. We have to be conscious and aware as we're going around, wherever we're coming from, of trying to collect and understand different situations and build relationships. So I think a lot of the networks and associations that represent various people with disabilities, and I know it's not one group, it's several, we need that sort of like understanding what other groups are doing and incorporating it in our work and supporting each other. The copy paste thing, data is a problem. We don't have the data we need to craft our own solutions. I have been looking to see, for example, the one thing for that which groups are going to be impacted. You don't have data around informal economies except those very broad figures, or 70%. But doing what? Why have we not been able to unpack who is where in the informal economy and map, and what are the kind of responses? And there's better off informal economy and worse off. So the lack of interest and data means it's actually impossible to create solutions or responses that are well crafted towards that. Even in terms of our health statistics, if you try and we're supposed to have permanent influenza and respiratory illness permanent monitoring surveillance systems, so that they can pick up any upticks of disease or pandemics. A pandemic could start here, it doesn't always come from outside. Yeah. So we're supposed to have those surveillance systems. And in all honesty, I cannot find any data on what has been picked up around those issues and how it works. So even if we wanted to know whether there have been COVID cases from somewhere before, it would really just be a matter of looking through who has been dying of pneumonia. Do we have, that secondary data is supposed to support the testing that we can't do, but it's been filled in the gap. So that's one of the issues I think that we need to push governments on, and we ourselves need to participate in crafting better data for better adapted policy responses.
Yeah. Thanks for that, Nancy. I mean, on that point where you talk about data, at least from the health side, we see in a statement coming from the SADC Secretariat recently that there's been a re-establishment and expansion of the technical committee for coordinating and monitoring the implementation of the SADC protocol on health. But in between disasters, I think there's a question to be asked around what is happening, what activities are taking place, but also as civil society organizations, are we playing our part in tracking and monitoring and holding our governments accountable to implementing some of these protocols that exist on paper? I know it's a discussion for another day, but I mean, there are all these initiatives at a policy level that exist, but they just seem to just exist at a on paper, but not in practice. I'm just gonna take two last questions, and as you respond to them, invite you to share with us your parting shots. I think you can also read the responses there, but there was one question around the responses that we're seeing around COVID. Will they reduce economic inequalities or increase them? That's one of the questions that's coming from Davison. And then the other one is, okay, I think that's a statement. It's not a question. A question from Namibia is, what avenues are available to challenge the naked abuse of power as we're seeing coming through from the police? And also, how can we minimize working in silos as the civil society organizations and get back to that coalition building that both you, Nancy and Lebohang, have talked about? The World Social Forum, the coalitions that we have seen around women's rights movements and the labor movement and in other spaces. How do we get back to that coalition building so that we can mobilize and build this demand from below for a different world?
Okay, thanks, Masego. I'll give it a first stab. I think on inequalities, there's so many different ways to respond to that, but I'll keep it brief. I think data shows that there'll probably be growing inequality between developed countries, not so much between the global north and the global south, and that there'll probably be a great period of ongoing turbulence. And remember, they've been in a state of turbulence with the Brexit and the strange intra-European tribalism that has revealed, and Trump's own economic nationalism, which has been the source of a huge amount of dis-ease, as well as and tension amongst themselves. And certainly, if the GDPs of the major economies, India, China, continue to increase, people will feel better. There'll be a market for things to happen. But certainly countries like Belgium, Luxembourg, and so on, Italy, even Switzerland has taken a bit of a pounding because they've got extremely unfavorable geography. I mean, they're on the belly of Italy, Switzerland, so on, France. But between us as African countries, I have been saying that I think that this is a fantastic opportunity to reframe old relationships, to renegotiate old, really toxic trade agreements, if one can even call them agreements, to relook at the ways in which, for example, we are able to recalibrate the Africa Free Trade Agreement so that in future, when these things happen, because I believe that because of the state of the planet, and because Western capitalism is a very slow learner. You'd have thought after 2008 they'd have learned, but they don't learn. So we're going to come back here, I'm sorry to say. We need to really rethink as African countries and global South allies, ways in which we can be a lot more interdependent and a lot more intradependent on the continent, and rethink what value chains actually mean. Value chains are not just about us exporting and importing between the European Union and and importing American chickens that nobody wanted. Actually that whole debacle put me off chicken for a really long time. It's more about the ways in which we're able to enable small-scale enterprises and rural farming on the continent, within our own communities, within our own countries, preferably, to avoid the rapture of importing and exporting from a distance, the economic rupture, the social rupture, the financial rupture, the transportation rupture, and of course the skill set that is lost by manufacturing and procuring abroad what we could manufacture and procure from amongst ourselves. I think I'll leave it there.
Nancy? Thank you, Lebohang.
Okay. So 2020, we're only in March, seeing how things have started. I don't think this coronavirus is going to be the last shock of the year. So I think we really have to brace ourselves and look ahead for possibly other disasters coming on top of this disaster. And so if this isn't a warning for us to be prepared for a long run of possibly quite a bad environment, I think we're missing the point of the warning that has been there. Terrible as it is, worse could still be coming down the road. A couple of questions around engagement with the state, lack of transparency. The interesting thing, I think, is that whether it's social media or people pushing and making noise and going to court is forcing a level of transparency. The more we do it, I think, and target specific gaps in terms of what the state is doing. If we look at our government's national strategy responses that they've put together, there's so many points there that if we need to be asking, whether it's through media or wherever, what are you doing about XYZ, which is in your pandemic response plan? Let's study those, point to each of those, ask where the data is, keep asking the questions around what they themselves have put on paper to do, because the gap between what's on paper and what's happening on the ground is the gap that we need to make sure gets filled, even though not everything is on paper. It's not ideal. And then just sort of there was a question, I think, that Nnimmo had, a point he had raised at the end about linking this with the ecology. Our economies are structured in this sort of neo-colonial extract, accumulate. So we have to change that economic dynamic to say you can't simply extract, we are extracting from households and we're extracting from the environment, and we are forgetting that both human, biological, social reproduction are key to even processes of wealth accumulation and prosperity. So we have to think about both the reproductive economy, the care economy, health, We cannot renew human capacities without having good health systems. We cannot have healthy economies without having healthy ecologies. So let's build our economies around a much more holistic view of not just extraction or production and GDP and accumulation, but really much more around what is it that makes, what goes into keeping an economy healthy and sustainable. That's the idea about sustainability. So yeah, that's it. And let's not work in silos. Let's learn. Sorry, one last point. If we think about development as lots of pieces coming together, as activists, we can't stay in our silos and say we're pro-development. We have to say development it's social, it's economic, etc. People specialize in different areas. It doesn't mean that we shouldn't be building the interconnections at the policy level to understand that health concerns us all, and so on and so forth. So let's have a holistic developmental perspective and teach ourselves so that we know more about what other people are doing, so that we have a collective vision around development, not just around the sectors that we're working in.
Thank you. You know, I mean, the conversation is going so well. I am thoroughly enjoying it, and I hate that I have to bring it to an end just when I was thinking we're getting into it, you know. But as I said at the beginning, it's the first of many conversations. We're looking to have a series in the next couple of weeks, 2 webinar series a week. And there's a lot that we're going to pick up from today's conversation. I think, Nancy, I really like where you ended there, because it takes us back to the question that has been on everybody's mind, at least on social media or things that I come across, is where people are asking, what is the new normal that we will come back to? And both you, Lebohang, and Nnimmo as well have said, it's definitely not the normal where we came from. And you're talking about really changing the economic dynamic of extraction. And how we get there is breaking out of our silos and perhaps reviving some of the movements, or if anything, learning from some of the movements that we had previously. The World Social Forum that Lebohang spoke about, the platforms for sharing knowledge and producing knowledge previously. And perhaps what this moment is teaching us is, while those were being peddled as alternative spaces, those were the real spaces. If policy was being shaped and framed from that perspective, perhaps we wouldn't be here right now, right? Because the very same lessons and the messages that we are putting across right now is things that we've been talking about in the past 20, 30 years. Not to give away our age or anybody's age, but it's things that have been on the agenda for a very, very long time. But the question is, going forward, how do we build the momentum? How do we make sure that we capitalize on the current public anger and frustration to make sure that what we have is very different from where we've been? And just to go back to why we're doing this, we felt as the trust that we needed a space to actually elevate the dialogue beyond national focused issues, to look at what are some of the common challenges that we are all frustrated about, and some of the solutions that we would like to see take place at a regional level, as well as just in the space of knowledge, but also to make sure that citizens are not bystanders in this process. We might be locked down, but our brains are not locked down, our ideas are not locked down. We remain connected and we are alive. We've got solutions, and we would like those solutions to gain traction in the public discourse around COVID. So I'm quite excited about this, and I'm very grateful for all the insights and foresights that you have shared. And like I said, there's so many other conversations, and we will pick up from the questions that we didn't answer here for the next ones. Please stay tuned and join us again on Friday and next week.